Hello. So thank you very much for inviting me to this fascinating workshop. So I'm Martin Pickering from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm a sort of card-carrying psycholinguist, really. That is, I'm not really an expert on language models, and I'm not even particularly an expert on educational psychology. But I hope that what I've got to say today may be of some interest to the workshop and to the community. And what I'm going to do today is very much a sort of thought experiment, kind of I suppose, a sort of rational analysis, if you like, of a kind of theoretical technology, so to speak. It's but I will talk about some experimental data in the middle. That is experimental data on large language models. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge that this work that I'm talking about is well, sort of stuff I've worked out in the last couple of weeks, really theoretically, but inspired a lot by conversations with Zhengwan Tsai and Yaroslav Ilonkovitz, who are here, and Greta Gandolfi and Simon Garrett over the years. So okay, so I'm going to go back to Levelt. That is the sort of the book that seemed to me started study of language production, essentially. And he provided the blueprint for the speaker, as he called it, where he said that you have something like this in your head when you're speaking. You have a conceptualizer, which kind of comes up with the sort of message or the idea that you want to talk about, and you in order to come up with this, you draw on a discourse model, background knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge, and so on. Then you convert what your message.
Martin, sorry to interrupt you. Your slides aren't advancing, so we're still on the title slide.
Right.
So that obviously.
Yes. Sorry, I've got you. I'm doing it on the wrong. Yeah, I understand. I'm terribly sorry. Right. So is that okay now? Have you got the slide?
Yes,
of
the slide has advanced. Yes, we can see the Levelt's blueprint for this.
That's good. Sorry, I've got two screens and I was getting the wrong screen was changing. So the Levelt blueprint for the speaker, he assumes a conceptualizer, a formulator, and an articulator, something that comes up with a message, something that converts it into linguistic representations, and then something that speaks. And the conceptualizer draws on your background knowledge, your discourse model, encyclopedia, and so on. The formulator draws on lexical entries, that's words essentially, and then you articulate. And then, having articulated, you sort of listen to yourself, and you can comprehend yourself via overt speech. And you can also comprehend yourself via a sort of inner speech, a kind of inner monitoring, where your phonetic plan in the original model that changed later on was something that you sort of accessed and you listened to, so to speak, and then you could monitor and check for errors and mistakes in what you were saying. So this is sort of standard in sort of theory of language production in a sense. And notice the point I want to make about all of this is that it's all within one human. Right, your discourse model, conceptualizer, etc., is all within a single person. Okay, now, but you can distribute these components across humans. Okay, so there's a lot of sociology going back to Goffman talking about how conceptualization can be split from formulation, is what it amounts to in modern terms. For example, in speech writing, formulation can be split off from articulation. For example, if you're reading someone else's talk, or as I think was happening earlier here, Dan, I think, was reading other people's questions. So that so Dan is not then taking any sort of ownership on the question itself. And also people complete each other's utterances by distributing lexical access. So in this example from Clark and Wilkes-Gibbs, when A says that tree has then B says tent worms. Now what B is doing there is filling in a word, tent worms. I have no idea what tent worms are, but anyway, what B is doing is filling in what the word that B believes that A is trying to say. It is not that B is producing it from B's own perspective. B is producing it in order to assist A. Okay, so all these are cases of distributing components across people in different sorts of ways. And what you notice here is the individuals are tightly aligned with each other. So let's take the tent worms example. B is trying to help A, not saying what B thinks. So B must act as A would act in this case. So A and B aren't independent interlocutors contributing to a dialogue. They are even more closely linked than that. They have sort of meshed identical plans, not merely compatible ones, in the sort of the language of the a philosophy of sort of joint activity by Michael Bratton and others. Okay, so you can distribute those components across people, but you can also distribute them across a human and a device. And here I'm sort of moving into the world that's inhabited by people like Hutchins and Andy Clark, who sort of take the view that cognition can be distributed beyond an individual mind. So Hutchins talks about how a cockpit remembers its speed, and Andy Clark has a book and various papers talking about supersizing the mind, where you're sort of essentially, the argument is that you're incorporating things like a pocket calculator perhaps into your own mind in some sense. Now he gives the example of, say, you consult a list when your memory is deficient, and say that's not really any different from if you're just calling up your own memories. But what you need is a tight yoking of some sort, so that the external objects must function with the same purpose as the internal processes. Now, I struggle a bit what that means when you talk about something like a list, but it seems to be fairly obvious when you're talking about models of the sort that we're talking about nowadays. So you might argue that lists and cockpits can't really contribute to cognitive processes, but as I say, what happens if the device is instead not a list or a cockpit, but rather is a computationally complex assistant, which has the same purpose as the mind that's been designed through design or learning to make it have the same purpose. And it's able to emulate the mind, so it does the right thing at the right speed. So in sum, the mind and the device are going to be aligned, but even more closely than in interlocutors in dialogue, because they're trying to do the same thing at the same time, so to speak. Okay, so let's go back to speech production in Leibel's model, and now let's augment it. Okay, so what I'm saying is, what happens if one or other of these components is outsourced essentially to a device? So you can have the language production process can be when you're conceptualizing a message of what you want to talk about, you could be prompted in principle with relevant information, the encyclopedic knowledge that you can't happen to remember or access at that time, let's say. You could be prompted with appropriate words if you're having word finding difficulty. So, you know, if you can't get this tent worms, then the device can prompt you with that. And also the device can assist with the process of formulating or conceptualizing, or with the process of comprehending and monitoring. And I'll come on to what I mean by that in a second. So how might this work? Well, such augmentation could in theory involve a human assistant whose job is to prompt as necessary. And I'm sort of mindful of occasional cases you see when someone is giving a talk or sort of having a discussion with someone, and someone is there to prompt them if they are, you know, having difficulty. This is sometimes what happens when you have an expert but who's got some memory difficulties. So you get that in occasional stage discussions. But humans in general are too slow and unreliable. The assistant is going to have to be faster than the speaker and know a lot more in order to be able to prompt and augment in a helpful way. For example, a human might not know the words that the speaker failed to access, but you want to have something which is better, is more reliable, that can do it. And this, I suggest, is what large language models can do, or will soon be able to do. They will be able to respond faster and more accurately than humans in ways that can assist in this process. I'm not making any claims about what is actually possible now in 2024. What I'm giving is a sort of, as I say, a sort of theoretical analysis of technology as to what I think should be possible in the future. However, there is a problem with this account so far, is that many of the representations that I'm talking about are actually internal to the speaker. So, for example, if the speaker can't convert a message into an appropriate syntactic representation, then how could the LLM prompt with such a representation? So, but I think there is an answer to this, which is to say that you can read the representations off the outputs if you do this in the right way. So the alternative is to deal with outputs that encode representations. So I go to our account of alignment just to explain this in a sense. So when we proposed that, Simon Garrett and I proposed an account of alignment, we said that people in dialogue align with each other, their mental representations become aligned. That is their sort of situation models, their representation of meaning, of words, of grammar, and so on. But the point is, of course, what they actually do is that they hear the other person in sound, not in. They don't directly see the representations. But however, the sound encodes the different levels of representations. So the interlocutors can use the sound that they hear to align their representations. So that, for example, if I produce an utterance which has a particular grammatical structure, such as a passive, then you'll be more likely to repeat back to me something of the same structure, a passive, even though there's nothing in the, even though what you're actually hearing me say is not a passive, you're hearing me say a particular sequence of sounds. So in the same way, I think a large language model will prompt with the actual language that's written or spoken, but language that encodes linguistic representations that the human has difficulty with. So I think the models can sort of work, can get access to the internal representations in that sense. Now, large language models are, can become aligned to the speaker. So dialogue is successful if the interlocutors align with each other. That's our argument. This is having the same understanding of the situation, but also using the same words in the same way. For example, aligning on referring expressions and completing each other's expressions. That all entails or requires some degree of aligned syntax and other sorts of alignment as well. So a large language model that successfully augments language production must be well aligned with the speaker. But as I said, recall that speaker large language model alignment needs to be closer than in dialogue. You need to have largely identical plans, largely identical activation of linguistic representations. So it has to be pretty good, but it also, in fact, in a sense, is even better than a human because it's got to be able to assist when the speaker goes off course. So in other words, you want something, a model that is drawing on the same, activating the same representations that we are as we're speaking, but doing it even better. So that if we fail, if we go off course, if we become disfluent or something, then it can prompt us and help us out. And so the speaker, and if so, the speaker's utterances, perhaps including timing and disfluencies, should provide the large language model with a transparent window to her underlying representations. So such alignment should be a consequence of general and speaker-specific learning. So the large language model is obviously going to work best at this if it were trained on the speaker's utterances. That is, if you personalized it. Now, this is a sort of nightmare thing from the point of view of privacy, but if you imagine wearing something around your neck that was recording everything you said all the time, then the device would be better at prompting you later on if you failed to if you fail to access something, or indeed if you starting to have memory problems or whatever it might be. So the prediction, so of course, large language models work by predicting the next word or strictly a token. A personalized large language model will predict the speaker rather than what is most likely across the community. So clearly then this large language model will then be aligned with the speaker. The predictions are going to encode likely syntactic representations, for example, just as in the interactive alignment account. And this can help the speaker. And a familiar but a crude version of this occurs in predictive texting. Okay, so what I want to do now then is think about this prediction in a bit more detail. And I'm taking another model that Simon Garrett and I proposed for sort of integrating language, an integrated model of language production and comprehension, and sort of applying that to this situation. So what I'm assuming here is that when you speak, this is based on computational neuroscience more generally. So when I plan to move my hand to a target, I prepare a motor command to move my hand to that target, but I also generate an efference copy of that command to generate the predicted hand movement. So in other words, whenever I'm actually performing an action, I'm also generating an efference copy. That is a sort of a copy of that I can use for computations to make predictions about essentially the experience of the hand movement. So, and you can get that ready before you move your hand. So if I move my hand to a target, I can predict where my hand ought to end up before I move my hand, and therefore if my hand doesn't end up in the right place, I can move it. I can move it when it gets there. So apply that to speaking. When you're speaking, I prepare what we call a production command to generate the linguistic representations and use them when I speak. But I also, according to this theory, generate an efference copy to generate predictions of those representations, typically before I actually construct them. And I can use the predictive representations to monitor production. So this is essentially an account of feed forward or prediction-based monitoring, which is a sort of a standard account of monitoring, that something like this must be going on, and that purely feedback monitoring can't be enough. Okay, so now what I'm going to do then is say, let's think about the large language model itself as the efference copy. Okay, so I'm producing an utterance, a long utterance, for example, a speech, and after each word, the large language model uses the context of what I've said, plus background knowledge about me, obviously generated on the basis of what it's learned from my utterances in the past, to predict my upcoming word. A more sophisticated AI would draw on non-linguistic context, not just the words. And if I'm slow or I'm making an error, then the model can assist. Okay, so this process is akin to what we call prediction by simulation, but prediction by simulation is what we use to predict what other people are doing. So when, as an addressee, you put yourself into the speaker's shoes to predict what it is the speaker is saying. But speaker large language model alignment is going to be closer than speaker addressee alignment, because the large language model is going to know, if it's been well designed, it's going to know a lot more about what it is that you're likely to say at that point. So presumably this process can be fast and relatively accurate. How accurate it's going to be depends on how predictable people's next word is, given enough context. So note that the large language model could also use the form of an error to assist in production. So if I come to a point, it's reasonably predictable what I'm going to say next, but not certain, then I make an error. But it's then the model can guess that it's like that I'm going to either produce a sound-related error or a meaning-related error, because that's what the vast majority of our errors are, either sound-related or meaning-related, and therefore it could use those to work out what it is that I was actually meaning to say, and therefore can propose what I should be saying. So both the speaker and the large language model can use error-based learning based on the discrepancy between them. So now you have a sort of account of learning where the learning processes are outsourced. It's kind of, sort of distributed cognition idea. So I've assumed that the large language model is used to overcome errors, difficulties, and so on. But the large language model can also prompt things that the speaker doesn't know. For example, unknown words, technical terms, or rare words for non-native speakers, specialist knowledge, or complex syntax, and so on. The large language model, as I said, doesn't have direct access to the speaker's representation, so it can't perform what Levelt calls inner loop monitoring, but it can use the speaker's utterance so far to determine the speaker's representations. And to do this, it must construct representations that are aligned with humans' representations, both their content and in terms of overall cognitive architecture. So at this point, I'm going to change tack and say, well, what do we know about large language models representations? And here I'm going to switch tack and talk about some empirical work that I've done with Zheng Sai and others, which is this essentially what we did was we took a dozen classic psycholinguistic experiments and we ran them through ChatGPT and then Vicuna to see how it behaves, how they behave, to see if they reproduce human behavior. And we just ran a dozen pre-registered experiments. like this. And we thought a lot of these things are very, very simple things. So sound simple shape association, which everyone of course is familiar with, that things like Maluma tend to be regarded as round and Taketi as spiky, and we asked if the language models do so too, and you just get to play a game like this. So I will say a word which may not exist in English. You have to guess if it refers to a round shape or spiky shape. Just say round or spiky, and we got it to do this, and it behaved like this. And basically what we found is that GPT replicated the behavior of humans. The human means are with the diamonds, and the behavior of GPT is in the graph. And then we did it with Vicuna as well, and we reproduced the pattern as well. Notice we didn't always find the same magnitudes of effects by any means. I'm talking about sort of directions of effects and equivalent significance. If you give it a sort of a sound gender association type issue, if you ask it to complete a sentence like although Pelkred was sick, it will tend to complete with he. If you say although Pelkra was sick, it would tend to complete with she. We just got the same. We just got it to do that, and again we found the same sort of pattern as we found as humans find with GPT and Vicuna. And if you have people tend to reuse a previously used meaning of an ambiguous word, so you give it a priming phase when it gets a context sentence essentially which uses the word in one or other sense, well, in the subordinate sense or a control word. And then it just has to make associations with words like post, and now it tends to associate that with the subordinate meaning, with the meaning that it has previously encountered, just in the same way as humans do. And final example of this sort of thing is implicit causality. You say Gary feared Anna because people will complete that with she was violent, or in most cases. Gary scared Anna because people will say he was violent. They'll do subject attribution and complete it that way. And of course, ChatGPT did the same, as did Vicuna, as humans. So those are just some examples of this, that they resembled humans in 10 out of 12 experiments. Vicuna did it in 7 out of 12 experiments. So by no means always. I'm not pretending these devices are perfectly reproducing what humans are doing in psycholinguistic experiments, but they're sort of getting fairly close, and presumably they will get better in due course. So these models don't seem to differ profoundly from the way humans reason and use language. Now, I'm more interested here in a case of structural priming, which is this tendency to repeat syntactic structure that you've recently encountered. And what we had is you have this. You get people. You follow the method we used in Pickering and Brannigan back in 20 years ago, where we have people complete fragments like the racing driver gave the helpful mechanic, and then people would say to the gave the helpful mechanic a tire or whatever, whereas the racing driver gave the torn overall, they will say to the mechanic. So they will complete them in a way that's consistent with one or other form of a dative sentence. Right? And then they get a target preamble, such as the patient showed, in the next thing that they have to complete, and they tend to copy the structure that they've just used in the previous sentence. Now, that's a simple experiment. What we found here was running this through these large language models, that they reproduced that pattern. And also, interestingly, we looked at something which we call the lexical boost, which is that structural priming is stronger when the prime and the target have the same verb. So you shift the verb from gave to showed when the target has also got showed, and now the tendency to repeat structure is greater. And again, the large language models reproduced this pattern as well. So broadly speaking, we're finding the same patterns in these systems as we are finding in humans, and suggesting that the internal representations, which is what I'm interested in here, are essentially similar. So that therefore, the models are already, before you do anything else, are already fairly well aligned with people in terms of the representations they have. So yes, and that's the same in Vicuna and GPT. Okay, so psycholinguists use priming to explore syntactic representations in humans and the architecture of language production more generally, and we can use priming in large language models to explore their representations. And as I say, we find broadly similar priming in humans and LLMs. So if you believe that these sorts of methods are reasonable ways of understanding what kind of model representations people have in their heads, then you presumably must accept that they also tell you what the models have in their heads as well. Okay, so that's the argument there. So the large language model should be able to determine the syntactic representations used by humans and use them to assist prediction. Similarly, it should be able to establish and use similar lexical representations of humans. So therefore, we should be able to augment language production by using large language models that are well aligned to humans, but can be faster, more knowledgeable, less affected by egocentric biases, and so on. Okay, now what I want to do for sort of 5 minutes at the end is talk about text production, because this was what I was really supposed to talk about. And I want to apply these sort of ideas now to text production rather than to spoken language production. And this should be easier to augment in a sense because it's largely offline. So if you go, rather than taking label, I noticed Hazen Flower was mentioned earlier today already. If you go back to traditional models of writing, they are sort of parallel to these models, the models of speaking, but in some sense. So you have the sort of focuses on the process of composition. I think these models are sort of partly prescriptive in a sense about how it's a good way to write rather than purely descriptive, but that's just my interpretation of them. But there's a rough correspondence between the components of speaking and writing models, and we can insert a device into this kind of model in the same way and have the goal of promoting good writing. So you have these cognitive writing processes, which sort of essentially correspond to conceptualization, formulation, etc., as well as having background knowledge and external context. So what happens in writing, though, is rather different from speech. Of course, it's very different from speech. Writers, what they tend to do, or they do always, is prepare a draft, as we would call it, and then they revise it as necessary. And then at some point they publish it, by which I mean they send it off to an actual or potential audience, making it public, whether it's writing a book or sending an SMS or whatever, it doesn't matter. So the draft is not public until this happens. It's available to be comprehended by the writers and by draft readers, that is critics and proofreaders. These draft readers can suggest changes to the writers or make those changes, can correct errors, style and content, and there are issues about this, when you have intellectual property rights to this, but I'm not going to get into that. And then you can read things to revise. So in these models of you also have if you're reading something in order to revise it, you're going to focus on the errors and focus on what's infelicitous and so on. You can detect problems of formulation, such as spelling or grammar faults. You can detect problems of conceptualization, sort of what you're saying is illogical or whatever, and you can pay attention to the audience as well, the potential audience. I'll come on to what I mean by the audience in a second. Okay, because when you speak, you have an audience of the person you're speaking to in a dialogue, let's say. But in writing, what audience means is much more complicated, and it's really very interesting from the point of view of what we call audience design in psycholinguistics. So, as with augmenting speech, the goal is to improve communication, but the focus is much more on improving the quality of a permanent or recorded text, both its style and content. You want to avoid ambiguities, and likely misinterpretations, and so on. There's much more time for suggesting and making revisions, so drafting is not generally time critical. You can revise repeatedly before publishing. But monitoring is primarily feedback, that is comprehension based monitoring rather than feed forward, or at least you don't have to sort of predict what you ought to be writing next. You can just look at what you've written already. So that's the way I think you can deal with augmentation. But interpretation has got to be appropriate for your target audience, which can be a specific individual, could be your friend, could be an ill-defined group such as cognitive scientists, or it can be for everyone or for posterity or whatever. This is the sort of notion of a generalized other that you're writing for that comes out of G.H. Mead originally, but it's sort of, but many other historical figures have come up with the same sorts of ideas. You know, or it can be that you're writing both for a specific and a general audience at the same time, a sort of super addressee, as it's sometimes called. So often the target audience is something like a reasonable person, someone who's appropriately informed. That's kind of critical for things like legal and constitutional interpretation, and also for literary appreciation. So we can regard this as something like the meaning of the text. This is getting very philosophical. But that doesn't really matter for now. So the large language model should be closely, but not exactly aligned with the writer. So you don't always notice your own errors because your intention gets in the way. This is the problem you have with proofreading your own work. So the large language model should detect when the intended audience might misinterpret the writer, rather than whether the writer might misinterpret him or herself. For example, the writer uses an ambiguous word that the audience would be likely to misinterpret. Therefore, the model should pick this up. This could be a simple homonymy, like a psychologist using significant in a way that's not going to be understood by a non-psychologist. But it could also be things like contestable concepts or ill-defined concepts, such as freedom or something like this, where people may have different views on what it means, and it may be partly political or whatever else is coming into it in deciding what it means. But in other words, you've got to get things right from a point of view of this audience design. So perhaps what it's doing, the model's doing, is determining the authorial intention and determining the discrepancy between the authorial intention and the appropriate audience's interpretation. That would be my guess. Anyway, so design needs and conclusions then. A large language model for augmenting speaking or writing needs to be well aligned with the human. So we wanted to draw on the same representations as the human. It needs to have the same architecture as all humans. That is roughly the same structure of internal representations. That might be different for different languages. I mean, that's possible in some theories. And if that's the case, then it would need to be, then the model would have to have different representations as well. It needs to know the human that it's dealing with well to determine what those representations are. And it needs some discrepancy, not have perfect alignments, as the author is not the same as the potential audience. So a spoken assistant is also going to work very fast, be largely dependent on prediction itself, that is feed-forward monitoring. But a written assistant can work off interpretation using feedback monitoring. It needs to have excellent background knowledge to improve writing in particular, but note that the human provides the original intention, and hence I would argue retains in some sense intellectual property. So we can develop a theory of augmented production to sit alongside existing theories of unaugmented production, and also perhaps if this kind of approach works, we can develop theories of augmented comprehension and augmented dialogue as well. So thank you very much.